So we are going into our second part of mindfulness for chronic pain, and we're going to be looking at a little bit of some effects that mindfulness has on the brain, and specifically some studies that looked at various parts of the brain in people who had studied mindfulness. And I'm going to kind of try to give an overarching theme as opposed to go into real detailed specifics. What I was saying is there are some brain regions that, regardless of um, your education or your background, that you might start seeing appearing even in the news or in like Time magazines or National Geographic or Discover any magazines that might talk about mindfulness meditation, even yoga magazines or massage magazines. And one of those areas that I think is important is called the default the default mode network. The default mode network. And if you kind of think of like everything that we've been talking about in terms of neuroscience with pain, um, the default mode network. So imagine they labeled this because it's sort of a network within the brain that we default to. So it's sort of like this default mode. And you may have heard, or we have discussed, the negativity bias, how we are sometimes evolutionarily primed to have this sort of negativity bias in our brains, in our mind. Well, the default mode network is three specific brain regions, specifically the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the temporal cortex. And what the default mode network essentially does is it facilitates processes. It integrates a lot of self-referential, so how we refer to ourself from external stimuli. So for instance, the default mode network, for instance, if you're maybe listening to a conversation and you're taking in that conversation and there's some sort of self-reference to that conversation that we are making. And this happens, it just happens spontaneously. It happens automatically. So imagine you feel an ouch in your shoulder, and it's taking a sensory input and it's creating a self-referencing experience from that sensory input that you're getting from that shoulder. So it's sort of taking information from both the outside world as well as sensory information, things that we're seeing, things that we're hearing, things that we're feeling, and creating a self-reference. We're also making this part of the brain is also important for making judgments out of this and appraisals, for instance. This is good. This is bad. Um, this shouldn't be the way it is. This is a part in the brain that it's constantly firing. So it's like so, and we all have this. We all have this default mode network. Um, so there is a specific part of this default mode network called the posterior cingulate cortex that is mostly affected by mindfulness practice. And how is it affected by mindfulness practice? So if you could imagine right? That we have this automatic default, right? So something that's default is sort of like we revert back to this, okay? And it's this connection between three main parts of the brain, and we are constantly processing information that is coming to this and creating a self-reference, creating a reference for ourselves and who we are and what it means for us, giving meaning to a certain experience, giving meaning to a certain sensory input, whatever that might be. Okay. And imagine that you are able to, with the practice of mindfulness, and they've specifically seen this, that you are able to uh, decrease the activation of one of these regions of the brain, causing you to decrease the activation of this default mode network that's constantly judging what's going on, that's causing a self-reference that essentially is trying to create a self-reference from any sensory experience that is coming to us. So imagine what this would be like for pain, for instance. Okay. You have a painful stimulus, the pain is coming in, you process it as a painful stimulus going to the brain, and then you create a judgment around it, a story around it, and you refer to yourself based on that stimulus. Okay. Does that make sense? So you're actually, it's almost like you are integrating this information and saying, oh, I am that pain. That pain is me. Have you ever felt as if when you were in so much pain that was all that was going on, that was it? It was like, that's my, that's my identity at that time. Okay. What mindfulness starts to do in this default mode network is actually decrease the activation of this PCC area, which causes us to almost distance, sort of like creating a distance between the sensory input that's coming in and creating a self-reference of that sensory input that's coming in. Okay. This is similar to the practice that we've done last session, where we tried to simply observe unpleasant sensations as sensations and not refer to them as, let's say, oh, this is my pain. Simply observing the sensation and not getting caught up with the story of the sensation, of the pain that's present. The story is that self-referencing part. It happens so spontaneously that sometimes we get caught, sort of like, here's the pain and here's the story. And in fact, what distresses us the most is not necessarily the sensation, but the story that's created by the sensation by our mind through this default mode network. Okay. So in essence, it's not necessarily the sensation that's causing the suffering. It's the processing of the sensation by the different areas of the brain that is so spontaneous that it feels like that is part of the pain, sort of the pain story. What else is it when, when you feel the pain? It's sort of like, oh, this is, this is the whole box that the pain is in, and it's got this story and these people and these emotions and things like that. And these are all things that are created by this default mode network. Right. When So what mindfulness actually does is it helps to decrease the activation of the default mode network. And so there can be some objectivity in regards to the sensory information that's coming in. That we can start to look at it as a sensation and start to notice the stories that might be around it, but not identify with the stories, not identify with the emotions that arise. And by using mindfulness, we can actually decrease the activation of the default mode network in real time. That literally, as you're practicing mindfulness, you can actually decrease this activation. They've also shown that, for instance, you don't need a lot of practice. That within 4 sessions of just 20 minutes of mindfulness practice, you can already decrease the activation of this default mode network. Okay. So, for instance, how many times have you had have you noticed what we consider to be, let's say, a painful sensation, and you notice the sensation, and then you start to ruminate about it? Has anyone had where you start to think, oh my goodness, how long is this going to last? This is going to last for so many years. I'm never going to get over this. This is horrible. Am I ever going to be able to work again? What are my family, what are my friends going to think of me? Am I going to be able to go outside the house? Am I going to need a wheelchair to walk? Have you ever had any of those ruminations about your pain, of distress that could occur? All right. All those ruminations, all those extra thoughts that occur, that's all the default mode network in action. So it's like, here's the sensory input. Here's what you're feeling. Let's say you're feeling increased pressure or stabbing in the low back. And then what happens? That triggers the default mode network to start ruminating about everything that could potentially happen, that starts self-referencing and starts identifying you as the pain. You start going down the rabbit hole, all right, of, oh my God, I'm going to be disabled in 2 weeks. This is going to be horrible, which then causes more anxiety, more fear, which then causes you to want to move less, which then activates more pain and more stress. That's all due to this default mode network that is active. So imagine, for instance, if you had the capacity to feel an unpleasant, even a very strong unpleasant sensory experience, like you just had back surgery or shoulder surgery or knee surgery, and yet your ruminations about it, your thought processes about it are no longer there. But there's no rumination. It simply is the sensation that is appearing at this time. And there's no worrying about what's going to happen in a week or 2 weeks. There's no judging yourself of who you are as a person, because maybe now you do have to use a walker or a cane to ambulate. But there's no thought process around that. For some, that might be relieving. Wow. That I can just feel that I just notice the sensations, the unpleasant sensations, but I don't have my whole like narrative around them, right? How many of us have a narrative around our pain? All that narrative is caused by that default mode network that's active. Okay. So, for instance, you can have strong sensory experience and you simply notice it as strong sensory experience without ruminating on it. That you don't identify yourself with with the pain. All those can be very, very powerful. Okay. One of the other things that we are talking about last session was that this uncoupling of the thalamus. So every single sensory input that comes up to our brain has to go through the thalamus. So the thalamus is a part of the brain that we call it sort of a major relay hub for every sensory experience that you have. Right? What they've actually seen is that when you're practicing mindfulness meditation, that there's not only a deactivation of this default mode network, but that there's also a deactivation of the thalamus. So imagine, for instance, that with mindfulness practice, you could decrease the ruminations about your pain, simply notice them as a sensory experience, not have a story being told about them, and change the actual stimulus that's coming to your brain. Because you are able to change the thalamus, allowing that stimulus to actually get to your brain. In pain, if the stimulus doesn't get to your brain, you don't feel it. All right. So if you have knee pain and the stimulus ain't getting to your brain, you don't feel it. So imagine as if you had the capacity, and we all do, to actually take the thalamus, and you know how, like, let's say it's like a filtering system, right? Have you ever been to the beach and or you know you're if you live in California, maybe you've done one of these things where you take uh, a filter or sieve or something like that, and you go mining for gold, right? And you put all the gravel and all the sand, and the width of the hole determines what you still have in your sieve, right? So if you have really, really tiny holes, you're going to have a lot. You're only getting rid of like the fine sand. As the holes get bigger and bigger, what happens? You start collecting bigger, and then you hold on to the biggest stones. The thalamus could be seen exactly like that. Like every single thing, like you pick up all the dirt, you pick up every stimulus, and then you start shaking it. What are you allowing through? What are you allowing through to the other side? Because if you don't allow it through to the other side, your brain's not seeing it. So imagine as if we actually, using mindfulness, we actually had an ability to change the holes on the filter that allowed what sensory information we wanted allowed to be activating the brain. That we can actually uncouple, we can actually deactivate the thalamus. We deactivate the thalamus, what happens? That sensory information is not getting through. not getting through. What happens if the sensory information doesn't get through? You don't actually feel that sensation. It's almost like the thalamus cuts it off. It's like, nope, I'm not letting this signal through. I'm not letting this rock through because it's not the right hole. The filter's too small on the hole. Okay. So these are very very powerful changes in the brain that occur with the practice of mindfulness. And this is as simple, it's not any, hardcore mindfulness technique. These are simple mindfulness techniques, such as ones that we have covered in the introduction class of bringing your attention to an anchor, of focusing on the sensations of your breath, or if some people described just being in pure awareness, will actually deactivate this default mode network, will start to deactivate the thalamus. And in real time, you're actually shifting the neurochemistry and the neuroanatomy in your brain of what is actually being active, of what areas of the brain are communicating with each other and whatnot. Okay. Simply through the practice. What we're going to do today as a practice, okay, is one that uses the anchor as a zone of safety. So essentially going to our anchor as a zone of resourcing, a place that we can feel safe, a place that we can feel more at peace. And then from this place of resource, see if we can open our awareness ever so slightly more to include any unpleasant sensation that's occurring in the moment. And you choose, and we do this thing called titrating or pendulating, which essentially is you go from your resource, from your anchor, which is a safe zone, to a place that is unpleasant. You open to that place that is unpleasant. Maybe it's an unpleasant sensory experience that's coming from your back, shoulders, knees, whatever that is. And you see, can you hold that unpleasant sensory experience? And you see, how long can I hold it? As a sensation, what does it look like? And if it gets too much or the intensity of the pain gets too high, you then return back to your anchor. So you're using your anchor as a resource. Sort of like you're holding on to the anchor and you're reaching out here and you're saying, can I grab that? How close to that, how can I touch that fire? Right? How close to the fire do I want to get? But you're still holding on to your anchor. And maybe you hold on to your anchor, holding, and you actually get really close to the fire. And you're able to investigate the fire. And you're able to say, wow, I can get pretty close to this fire and sort of watch it as a sensation. If it gets too intense, what happens? I sort of pull my hand back and come back to my anchor. And we do this, and this is called titrating. It's sort of going back and forth, back and forth. And in essence, what you're doing is you're bringing the awareness from your resource to your unpleasant sensory experience, to whatever pain you're having. As if it gets too much, you come back to your resource. Go to the unpleasant experience, come back to your resource. Go to the unpleasant experience, and then see, oh, can I hold my resource and, let's say, the pain in my shoulder simultaneously? And notice what happens to the pain in the shoulder. Notice what happens to the sensory information of the pain in the shoulder. Does it change? Does it stay? Does it increase in intensity, decrease in intensity? I don't actually know what will happen, because sometimes it can increase in intensity. Okay. So let's go into our practice. Okay, so let's find a comfortable position. A position you will feel relaxed yet alert. Closing your eyes if you feel comfortable closing your eyes. If not, having a soft downward gaze. And taking 2 or 3 deep breaths. And with each in-breath, bringing in the present moment, and with each out-breath, just seeing if you can relax and release any tension that you may be feeling in your body. And breathing regularly for you. And directing your attention to your anchor. A place that you feel that you can direct your attention to, that is safer, more at peace. Simply doing this practice can help move your attention away from strong sensations that are present in the body to something more pleasant or neutral. Your anchor could be another sensation in the body, the contact your feet or hands are making with the surface they are on. Could be the sensation of the breath, or counting your breaths, a repetition of a word or phrase or a prayer. It may be something outside your body, like a flower, an image of a guru, a loved one, a spiritual figure, a pet. It could be a memory or a vision of something that creates that sense of safety, ease, peace. You may notice strong sensations trying to pull your attention away from your anchor. Simply noticing those sensations for now and seeing if you can come back to your anchor. By coming back to the anchor, we're helping our body relax. We're decreasing our fight or flight response in the body. We're helping to deactivate the thalamus, deactivate the default mode network. Do you notice any ruminations or stories around your pain? If you do, for this practice, simply choosing not to pay attention to them, not to attach too much or give them too much validity, and simply coming back to your anchor. And now, if you wish, seeing if you can include some unpleasant sensory experience in your awareness. From your anchor, find a place in your body that has an unpleasant sensory experience, an unpleasant sensation. Almost as if you're sort of looking at it from the corner of your eye. If your awareness and attention is on the anchor, as if you sort of look at the unpleasant sensation out of the corner of your awareness. Can you include it? Can you say, I see you? We're oftentimes trying to turn away from our pain, resisting, wanting it to go away. From the resource of your anchor, seeing, can you turn towards it? Can you oh so slightly open your awareness to include even a part of the unpleasant sensation? If it gets too intense, simply going back to your anchor and doing what you feel comfortable doing. From your anchor, again opening up to an unpleasant sensation. Can you include even that in your present moment awareness from the perspective of your anchor, your resource? And if it becomes too intense at any time, simply coming back to your anchor. This is a process of titrating, pendulating, going from your anchor, a place that is resourcing, safer, more at peace, to an unpleasant sensation, and seeing if we can, oh so slightly more, hold both simultaneously in our awareness. We're not resisting the unpleasant sensation. We're increasing our capacity to be with it. In real time, shifting the way our mind refers to it, identifies with it, creates stories around it. As well as decreasing the signals coming up from the body to the brain. And just noticing how you feel. Noticing if there was any change to the unpleasant sensation. Is it waxing and waning? Did it increase in intensity or decrease in intensity? Or is it still the same? And now, as we bring this meditation to a close, coming back to your resource, coming back to your anchor, just noticing how this worked for you. Did it help in any way? This process of resourcing, anchoring, and titrating. You may notice that the sensation is still present, but maybe the reactivity of the mind has changed in some way. Almost as if the sensation is there, but it's not as bothersome. Maybe we don't need to fear it as much. Or maybe there's no change at all. And now taking 2 or 3 deep breaths. Opening your eyes if your eyes were closed. Reorienting yourself to your room and surroundings. Feeling your feet on the floor, your hands on your lap, your thighs against your chair. Stretching if you feel like you need to stretch. And just taking a moment to reflect on your practice.